Well, patch 1.12 for Elden Ring has finally dropped, and with it are the patch notes. They are pretty extensive. I'm just going to go through the cliff notes of some of the important points from this patch because I got a lot to do today with the launch coming. But note that most of these changes are to the base game and things that you would find there. So there are a couple miscellaneous changes I want to mention first before I go into balancing. The first thing is that there's going to be a new recent tab that will allow you to see items you've recently picked up. This will come in very handy in the DLC when you're playing. Sometimes when you pick up an item, you don't know what it is, even though there's a little icon like telling you what it is. You might not have seen it real quick or whatever. You should be able to find this quickly. Additionally, you can now use Torrent during the Elden Beast boss battle. This should be very interesting. This is a fight where you have a lot of distance to cover a lot of the time, so can't wait to see how that is. I have not tried that out yet. And lastly, they have made it so that crafted consumable items that you use during your Colosseum battles are automatically replenished afterward. This is only crafted consumable items, not all consumable items. But that means that you don't have to like hoard your consumables and not use them when you're in Colosseum. And if you craft a bunch, then you don't have to worry about going through them constantly, which is great. So first I'll cover PvP balancing really quickly before I get into some of the PvE changes. If you go through the PvP changes, essentially what I'm seeing here is the first thing is that Madness and Sleep buildup, if you apply them to a player, the status effect buildup will be halted for a short period of time afterwards. So you can't just chain these back to back in PvP. So if you look through the PvP changes here, essentially what you're seeing is a shift towards, changing up the meta through poise damage. They're trying to increase the poise damage that players deal to players that are using weapons with high poise damage. They are also increasing the poise damage of dual wield attacks against players using weapons with high poise damage. And they are trying to increase the poise damage using axes, hammers, halberds, and reapers effectively. So it seems like what's happening here is that there's like a subset of weapons, I'm guessing it's axes, hammers, halberds, reapers, and maybe a couple other weapons that are not as effective in PvP in terms of poise damage and damage output. And the balancing changes are trying to kind of bring all the weapons on par in that regard so that, it'll open up more builds that are possible in PvP. And if you look at weapon skills for PvP, it looks like they're just pretty much nerfs across the board for certain skills that are being abused. Spinning Slash, Flaming Strike, Rain of Arrows, Cursed Blood Slash, Transient Moonlight, all had their damage decreased. Ancient Lightning Spear, Radon's Rain, and then it looks like a few others have had their poise damage nerfed, like Lightning Storm and Rain of Arrows and Spear Call Ritual. It looks like a lot of, just straight up nerfs across the board. Bestial Sling's spell has also had poise damage nerfed, although all the other spells seem pretty much the same except Black Flame's Protection, which has physical block rate reduced. More nerfs across the board. And when you look at the general balancing changes, notable ones are increased dexterity scaling when assigning Ashes of War with corresponding weapon affinities. I think this is probably done to get players to use dex builds more often. As it stands now, if you're playing like a one-handed dex build, even if your damage is a little bit higher than strength, it doesn't seem like there's as much of an upside, simply because if you two-handed that weapon you were playing heavy, you would have the extra scaling from heavy. And if you weren't and you were one-handing, you could use a shield. So I think they're trying to make it so there's more of a reason to use dexterity scaling. It also looks like they've increased the attack speed of axes, great axes, hammers, flails, and reapers. I'm assuming these are the least used weapon types. I know From gathers data about this, so I'm assuming they're trying to entice players to use these weapons more. And they've also increased the damage of charged attacks of axes, great axes, and some colossal weapons. I'm assuming those are like colossal axes. I'm assuming that's because that the axe talisman increases damage of charged heavy attacks, and so they're trying to separate axes, great axes, and probably colossal axes into like more charged heavy attack damage, giving players a reason to use them over something like a hammer that has more poise damage or stance damage. They've also increased the damage of whips, which is another weapon type I don't think is used all that often, and they've also increased the speed of consecutive attacks with light bows and long bows. This is actually really interesting because light bows, I made a video about this where players, were better off like rolling and shooting and running and shooting. And I think that's still the case for your first shot, but you might be better off on subsequent shots just taking the shot. Now, I haven't tested this out, but that should help to make bows more viable. And one thing I want to note too, mild spoiler here, is that there are quite a few talismans in the DLC that do impact bows. So I think bows in general are going to be more viable than they were before. And to piggyback off that, they've also increased the attack power of arrows, great arrows, bolts, and great bolts that can be crafted. Hopefully this means they brought this on par with that you can buy. It's not super important late game, but early on in the game that can make a huge difference. And then two more changes: decrease the effect that increases the power of spells of Terra Magica, and decrease the effect duration of the Cerulean Hidden Tier. I think these are two major nerfs in my opinion. Terra Magica is a spell that can really ramp up damage of spells if you're standing in the area considerably, and Cerulean Hidden Tier reduces the cost of spells for a given amount of time to 0. So you can like walk into a boss fight, pop this, and then just like hold down a button on spells that drain your FP and melt bosses. So I think they're trying to nerf builds that do that. I have made a few builds like that. So it seems like they're kind of tweaking things a little bit, trying to get players to use weapons that they don't normally use, while also simultaneously like nerfing some of the build cheese potential out there. They've also adjusted some weapons, like maybe a couple of handfuls of weapons here. The most notable, in my opinion, are the staffs and seals. They've actually increased the Alvinaric staff, Gelmor Glintstone staff, Prince of Death staff in terms of attribute scaling, which would be curious to see, if people will actually use those staffs. Now, Prince of Death was really hard to use unless you were like NG+. Golden Order seal has increased attribute scaling. That's interesting. Clawmark seal as well. I think that's probably because going into the DLC, Clawmark seal isn't going to be very viable, and now it might be viable in the DLC area. They've also increased Dragon Communion seal. This is crazy. Dragon Communion seal had fantastic scaling, so I'm curious to see how this is going to be. There are new dragon spells, so maybe that's why they did that. And then when it comes to weapon skills, notable ones: Spinning Slash has had its status effect buildup decreased. This had really good status effect buildup. I don't know if you knew that. Glintblade Phalanx has decreased poise damage. This was a poise or stance breaker. This thing was absolutely nasty at breaking stances. I wonder how much they nerfed this. I'd be curious to see. It did 40 poise, 10 per like sword. So that's probably down to like 8 or 7 or something. We'll have to see this. So they've also increased some of the bow weapon skills. It says Strong Shot here, but that's not a weapon skill. I'm assuming they mean Mighty Shot. It says increase the speed of its attacks. I'm assuming that means it attacks faster. Sky Shot has increased the speed when doing consecutive attacks, allowing you to use Sky Shot like more quickly in a row. And Enchanted Shot increases the speed of some attacks. I'm assuming that means that, it and Mighty Shot basically have the same speed of animation they did before, so they still do now, which is faster. They've also changed some of the parry skills here. Like parry has hitbox generation speed has been increased, so is Stormwall, and so is Thop's Barrier, and Buckler parry has added attack recovery time after using this skill. Assuming so you can't just spam it if you like whiff a parry really hard. But that should bring like parry, Stormwall, and Thop's Barrier closer to like Carrion Retaliation or something like that. I mean, everyone uses Carrion Retaliation for parrying. I think the idea here is to give you more options, or to make these skills a little bit better so that they are more viable. Blasphemous Blade also got a nerf here. Its weapon skill, Taker's Flames, this has decreased fire's poise damage. So I'm assuming on the fire wave that goes out, the poise damage goes down. And it's removed the knockdown effect from the fire. So that's probably not going to be nearly as good as it used to be. Moonlight Greatsword also got a nerf. They increased the poise damage of heavy and charged attacks, but decreased the poise damage of the wave that comes out. That wave is what you would use to stagger bosses. So that means you got to be really close to use this weapon, making it a lot less effective as before. I don't know how much, the poise was nerfed here, but that's not great. And another notable one is Contagious Fury. This was the weapon skill on the Jellyfish Shield that would boost your attack power. This has also been nerfed. This is another one that like people use constantly. So there is going to be a huge shift in builds, I think. Some of them are going to be better. Some of them are going to be worse. I think most of them are going to be worse in general compared to what they were previously. But I do think this is going to encourage people to use new DLC builds, and we have a lot ready for you. None of the builds we've been making are affected by these changes because we are using new weapons and new weapon skills for like 99% of them, and this affects, most of the old ones. Really, all that these balancing adjustments affect are like, maybe weapon attack speeds and things like that. But again, most of the builds we're doing are showcasing new weapons, at least so far. So this shouldn't impact any of them. There are, of course, other bug fixes and such, but what do you guys make of these changes? These are some substantial changes to the game. It's a pretty big patch in my opinion. Are you guys ready for the DLC? Let me know in the comments below.